Welcome everyone. Really close. Welcome all to day 2. We said first day 0. Okay, day 2. ISART. I hope you guys everyone's enjoying themselves. So right, we're kind of really getting into the meat of the thing. We start with the tutorial, which I'm very pleased on day 0. Had a lot of positive feedback from that. That's gone really well. Yesterday, we kicked it off with Fireside Chat, kind of talking global perspective with Canada and the UK / SG3 in the US, having some discussions and answering some questions. And then we started to drill down into kind of as we broke the problem down, right? Because that's the gist of what we're doing here at ISART on this topic of clutter, is we're trying to break it down into pieces. So we started kind of the bigger picture of defining the problem, talking about. We then went into modeling, and today we're going to further kind of drill down into other components of the larger piece, in particular measurement. We have a measurement panel here in the morning that's going to be talking about some of the topics we touched on a little bit even yesterday, in the sense of measurement data, measurement quality, those sorts of topics. And then we'll be talking about kind of another panel in the afternoon talking about applications of models to real-world scenarios, right? We all know that even if we build a model, as we talked yesterday in the modeling panel, there's assumptions and how and kind of a framework that's developed, and we do work our hardest to make that apply to the real problem we're working on. But there's always a little bit of disconnect, right? Things change in the meantime. These processes, there's time delays. So, how do we actually apply problems to real-world systems that may or may not that we take to underdo the model development? So those 2 panels should be really good. Sprinkled in among those, we have some technical talks on a variety of different topics. We have some talks on both from the commercial and government side about coordination and network planning. And then, much like we had a talk yesterday, we try here at ISART we're very focused on a topic, but sometimes it's useful to look at parallel fields that tackle similar problems. They're useful analogies to kind of think, that they tackle things very similar to us. And so we have a technical talk by a meteorologist and about how they incorporate data, right? It's very similar. They're taking environmental and observational data, they're building models, and they're trying to make predictions. At a high level, it's very similar to what we're trying to do in propagation. And so that should be a very interesting talk, kind of as to cue up some thoughts in our mind about what can we learn from the meteorological field, which has been around much longer than the propagation field. I would possibly say they've progressed farther in the ability to gather data of varying data sources and incorporate that in. So that should be good as well. One of the things that I do want us to think about as we continue on here, we had some discussion on this yesterday, is, what's the purpose, the overall, outcome, one of the things that we want to get out of this conference. And so, we've had some discussion, we've had some disagreement. Differences of opinions are great, and they spur further conversation and kind of really looking at the details. But I'd ask all of you in this room, when we're having these conversations and we're asking questions, we're thinking about is, what's the next step? It's great we're meeting here. It's great we're having these discussions. What's next? We don't want to leave this conference and say, that was really interesting, I learned stuff, and then that's the end. This conference is the beginning of a process. We want to have those conversations, then we want to come out of here and think, what do we do next? Hey, I want to partner with so-and-so to pursue this idea. I want to go conduct measurements to prove or disprove somebody else's comment because I'm really interested in what that answer is. I want to propose some sort of new area of study or new type of analysis. So really think about that as we're having these conversations about, what are the outcomes? What's actionable after this meeting's over? Make those connections, talk to those people, and let's start this to be the beginning. We have the national spectrum strategy. It's really just kicking off. We've talked a bunch about 3 gigahertz, but really in kind of leading into the future work coming up here in 7 to 8 gigahertz. And there's a lot of things that we can take from here and start to forward think. We all want to work the problems before decisions are made. Sometimes we know there's both some of that doing that simultaneously. from an engineering side, but, let's think about how we can take away from this thing. So I encourage everyone today to think about that, have those discussions during lunch and during breaks. And with that, I know I'm short, but we're just gonna roll with that. I think we're going to the fireside chat next. Right, Jeremy? Yeah, are there any questions?
Thank you, Billy. All right, we are getting set, and we'll have Ira Keltz and from the FCC and Derek Klippen from NTIA join me up here for a fireside chat. All right, well, welcome. Welcome to ISART. Day 2, where we did a few deep dives, starting with the tutorial, and and then we had some excellent panels and a lot of good discussion topics. I'll try to weave a few in as we go along today, but really we want to kind of kick off this morning session by taking a few steps back. Maybe not quite 30,000 foot view, but we'll see. But we want to hear from, we wanted to kind of fill in a little bit more on the idea of clutter. The idea of consensus. We might get to clutter, we'll see. But hearing from both, NTIA and FCC, particularly with the close relationship and the collaboration that's been ongoing as we kind of delve into the national spectrum strategy and sharing and a lot of complex issues. But so I wanted to hear, to allow you to hear some of the perspectives on, what does building consensus look like in reality, like on the ground, and from your two perspectives. And so the fireside chat hopefully allow a little bit more in-depth sharing and discussion on that topic. So the bios for all of our speakers are in the agenda, but Ira, would you just kick us off with sharing, initially when you're thinking about consensus and your role at the FCC, how do you define that?
Right. Well, thanks, and thanks for having me here. It's been a number of years since I've been able to participate in ISART. But to get to the question, it's a really difficult issue. Conceptually, consensus seems easy. And, I did do a quick look in the dictionary, if people remember what those are, book with a lot of words. And consensus, is defined as unanimity, as getting everybody to agree. And that's kind of hard. It's really hard. But, but how do we get there? And we've seen a lot of good examples that we've been able to get to with a lot of work from the Commission, from NTIA, from the industry folks, and a lot of the federal agencies. And that comes through compromise. So in order to get everybody to agree, people often need to maybe, compromise. You can't always get everything you want, but is it good enough? And, I think when thinking about that, and then in the context of this workshop, which is, 3 days on a deep dive on clutter, if you ask a whole bunch of engineers, 5 engineers, how to approach clutter, you'll probably get 12 different opinions. So, but what can we do in looking at these types of issues in order to do something that is good enough, is based in reality, is kind of not necessarily worst case, maybe not best case, but gets us moving the ball forward in creating a better spectrum environment for all these systems to operate as it gets more and more dense. And I think the poster child, it's probably been mentioned before, is CBRS. I mean, you look at where that went from. So first of all, we kind of it was a lot of work on the front end to get a lot of buy-in from various aspects, from the DoD, from the Navy folks, and the DoD CIO office, from the industry folks, to kind of get an approach and to just the concept of that the framework we adopted. But if you remember, when that started, the initial exclusion zones that were drawn up were huge. They would have knocked out, I think, something like 75% of the U.S. population, which couldn't get service. So why bother? But to their credit, NTIA, the engineers went back, kind of looked at things a little bit more realistically, and were able to reduce those zones quite a bit. That it actually now made sense that the commercial side could invest, and the Navy felt comfortable that their radars would be protected. And we created these dynamic protection areas and so forth. And now look where we are coming forward, where there's been all these announcements of a further additional look at the propagation models, a lot of it having to do with the way we treat the clutter in order to be even more realistic, where we can provide commercial service, without risk of interruption to tens and tens of millions of more people, simply because we were able to have the engineers get together, look at things, some of it based on some of the experience, and some of it based on maybe looking at things in a little bit more of a real sense, and again, and reach this consensus on what's in the art of the possible and how do we make things work as well as we can. And so I think it just really comes down to, I think, people being open-minded with these approaches. And then from the standpoint of the agencies, I think, the FCC and NTIA, I think the relationship between the two agencies is about as good as I've ever seen it in my almost 30 years working at the commission, which has been really good. And I think it's really helpful in being able to brainstorm on creative ways to attack these things, these issues in front of us, and come up with things that are going to work, that all the various stakeholders can be comfortable with.
Thanks. Derek?
Thank you, Jeremy. And I said a lot there, still a little of my thunder, but I think I can build on a few things. I thought, two things about, one, to sort of in pursuit of consensus, as if we're pursuing it. Are we going to achieve it? I think it's something that's always going to be out there as we strive for. And then I also sort of draw a little bit of a distinction, I think, between consensus and some of the technical work and the consensus on policy, and because even if you can come to a sort of agreement on what some technical parameters are, or what some technical conclusions are, it doesn't mean you're going to agree on the same policy outcomes. And I think that's where we face some challenges too. But I think there's been a real effort to strive toward, at least get the technical foundations agreed to, and then the policy conversations become exactly what they are. Maybe you make some difficult choices, but at least people aren't arguing as much on the technical side. Now, as Iris said, different parties are going to come in with different technical analysis, and the more you can push toward consensus, particularly on the inputs that go into, for example, in the studies, the better it becomes. So again, I think that's a couple things in terms of building consensus. We've got a number of avenues currently that we work toward that. I will, start with the IRAC at NTIA. The IRAC, the Interdepartmental Radio Advisory Committee, I believe it's the longest standing, government interagency body. It's over 100 years old. Phenomenal, right? So that is a body that works toward this, and the thing is, the successes there don't make the news, right? It's when you bump into challenges. But everything from agreeing to different frequency assignments to federal agency positions going into the WRC globally, everything gets worked through there. Interagency input to FCC proceedings. We coordinate extensively with the commission. As Ira said, the foundation is really good. It's strong. A couple of years ago, we renewed or revised the MOU between FCC and NTIA on how we do that collaboration. Again, NTIA coming in there representing the federal agencies of the executive branch, with the FCC as an independent agency. And I know folks in this room are familiar with it, but we have this bifurcated spectrum regulatory model in the United States of FCC managing all spectrum that's not federal. So they manage commercial, personal, state, local, public safety, and then NTIA manages federal government use. So because of that, we have to coordinate, but it doesn't mean you do it well. And I think we've been able to do that pretty well. On the interagency side, we have our own vehicles as well too. I mentioned the IRAC. For years, we had the PPSG, the Policy and Plan Steering Group, that's now been replaced by the ISAC, the Interagency Spectrum Advisory Council, under the presidential memorandum, which will operate fairly similarly, again, to drive toward consensus. So those are some of the frameworks. I think we'll talk more through the issues. I will come back to CBRS. That to me has been the gold standard. We had a lot of conversations yesterday about it. I know my colleague Shiva talked about it. It's come up, and these improvements we've made have been phenomenal. I couldn't say yesterday, but I think NTIA's got a press release and FCC going up any second now. So I think we're in a pretty good place to talk about it. But we are now looking to provide an opportunity now for decreasing the DPAs, the areas where you may need to protect more and have the possibility for services to be interrupted by incumbent federal uses. And the real props go out to Navy working with NTIA and FCC on this to really decrease these. And it's exciting. we anticipate FCC, very much welcoming this, as I'm sure Ira will comment, and looking forward to the SAS administrators then demonstrating that they can run with this. And the numbers we've crunched is as many as 72 million of the U.S. population will now be part of these areas that aren't encumbered by the DPA. So we think that's extremely exciting. And again, it shows an area where you get these working groups together amongst industry and FCC and NTIA and DoD, and you do the work, and you're able to come to a consensus that, yes, we can make some changes here to positively impact spectrum usage. So, I think to me, CBRS continues to be kind of that glowing example. A lot of things come together there perfectly. So not everything that applies there and how we've done that work is going to work everywhere else. But there's a lot of lessons learned there on how we can cooperate collaboratively.
So two quick points. One, beyond CBRS, because even though that's a great example, there's plenty of others. Look at the 3.45 band, where we used a different method of providing for areas where federal operations can continue to operate. And we were able to clear the rest of the country for commercial operations. A little bit different way of, again, reaching a consensus, reaching a compromise among the various parties for what's in the art of the possible in order to create a framework that does satisfy the needs of all the various parties. The other thing, Derek mentioned was looking at the models and the assumptions. And for folks who deal with us a lot, that's where a lot of our proceedings always seem to come to a bit of a head, is we get studies that have conflicting sets of assumptions, conflicting sets of inputs. And that's one place that if folks can sort of kind of get together, maybe beforehand, and reach some sort of consensus on, even if it's not the exact set of inputs, but at least the reasonable range without stretching to the extremes. Because again, I think the commission, and we said this in our policy statement last year, is we're trying to look at things in a more realistic view. Not looking at necessarily worst case or best case, but what's realistic. And then once you understand what's realistic, and if it's in a way that the folks do agree on, that this is reasonably what to expect, you can throw some safety margins around that to protect, whether it's for one standard deviation or two or whatnot, and not necessarily create an entire framework or policy to protect the 1% or 0.5% of the cases. We could deal with those as they come up, but in order to create the best telecom system we can in the U.S., using the best technology and the best policy, there does have to be some give and take, and there has to be some recognition of doing things realistically, and again, a coming together of the minds of the various different parties who do have different competing interests, but trying to get to that same place to put us in the best position we can, on the global scale, to have, so that all these things can work. It's good for the economy. It's good for our, the federal agencies. It just benefits the country overall in many, many aspects.
So if I could just jump on that too. I mean, it sort of begs the question: how do we get there? And I think it's hard with the private sector, right? A lot of different interests, and maybe there's some forums. I mean, one of the things that both through the presidential memorandum and the national spectrum strategy we've looked at is how do we advance some of this evidence-based and scientific-based processes? And there's some action items in there for the interagency and working with industry to come up with best practices on studies and domestic, and this applies in the WRC context too, right? You have these studies that go globally. I think I was talking Mark McHenry in the elevator, and Mark said, well, you guys, all these tasks you have in the NSS, NTIA's got a lot on its plate. You haven't really put that much on there for industry, and that's, I promise you, that's going to change. And I think what we're doing now is figuring out how to structure some of these things. So I mean, I would tell folks, expect forums, working groups. I mean, we have this, under pillar 2 of the NSS on the collaboration framework. All this is designed to figure out how to bring people together in a better way. And there's challenges how you do that with the government. There's challenges with the FCC because they have, they have rulemakings, they have APA, a little different. But but we're trying to figure out a way to create more of these forums where we can bring people together to drive toward these things like consensus. And again, sometimes you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. No one's ever going to be fully satisfied either with the process or the outcomes, but we're trying to open those doors and do a better job.
Yeah, we talk a lot about agreement on inputs, and on the modeling side, it's the underlying assumptions. But it sounds like there's quite a few, obviously, policy inputs as well. So you got policy inputs, and you got technology and technical inputs. How do you balance that to achieve some consensus, like you mentioned the press release coming out, Derek? But even going back to CBRS or before, how do you kind of manage those policy inputs and technical inputs to make sure folks get on board?
So I think part of it is you need to have a sense of where you want to get to. What's the end game? And then how do you develop smart, reasonable, good policies to get there? And, I think sometimes we throw things out there, and maybe see what'll stick. And sometimes we have some really specific goals or things in mind. So again, kind of going back to CBRS, or even the 3450, we kind of knew what we wanted to get to. CBRS, we wanted to try out this new framework with this multi-tiered sharing system, proof of concept for this database, dynamic sharing. 3450, we were trying to clear as much spectrum as we could to provide opportunities for exclusive use for some of our telecom carriers. And knowing that, then you can kind of almost work backwards. There are other places where we kind of say, well, we're not sure exactly what'll work, and we're looking for ideas. And once we kind of get a sense of what the industry thinks, and then also what's the federal side can think, and especially in the shared bands, we can kind of think through, how can we now structure something that's going to work and move the ball forward on whatever our goal might be, which is, again, more efficient spectrum use, expanding opportunities, and so on and so forth. So again, it's not an easy or straightforward answer. And I think, unfortunately, like a lot of things, it depends. But I think a lot of it, what we're seeing over the last couple of years in these collaborations, in the lower 3 gigahertz, we had the PADS process. We have the next iteration of PADS, getting industry, getting DoD, getting academics all together at the very start of a process to kind of get everybody in the room who has some thoughts, ideas, and various stakes in the outcome to throw some ideas out and to trade, information in order to, have something moving forward that there is some agreement on how to approach this, how to structure this, and then that gives something to us as the regulator that we can then work with, within the regulatory process to kind of get to something that we know can work. And if we can do that, if we do it right, it can shortchange the time of the rulemaking process, which, as folks know, they can stretch out, especially the real complicated ones. But if we can reach some consensus, some agreements at the beginning, it won't solve every of those issues. But if we can get some of the bigger ones out of the way, that we can move forward, then we can nibble around the edges and put something out there that we can get stuff out a lot quicker, I think. And I think that's kind of where we're trying to get to. Some of what the spectrum strategy is envisioning, a lot of the collaboration that's going to happen through that, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo everything there. I think on these band studies under the NSS, right, we're not, as opposed to CBRS where you kind of knew that outcome, knew you were going forward. We're a little more open-minded. I mean, that's not to divorce there's policy there, right? I mean, there's a reason why we're looking at those particular bands, right? They are, attractive for certain uses and interest by the private sector. So you have that, but in terms of what the outcome looks like, we're really trying to go in and let the technical analysis drive the outcomes. So trying to separate that a little bit. I mean, there's other cases where you really are trying to drive toward an outcome. If you think of things like intelligent transportation systems at 5.9, like there you're trying to actually, in a way, sort of move a market forward that hasn't really been there. So there's they kind of play together in different ways. I think in terms of just coexistence generally, right? Like a lot of these challenges, at this point, I think we're just trying to figure out how we move forward. I think one we're really emerging one is how we deal with passive services everywhere, right? I mean, this is as we cram everything into these bands and we look at new bands, we're just seeing that there's technologies that really are pretty inconsistent in the way they operate with each other, right? And how do so when you're talking about spectrum sharing amongst like systems is one thing, but when you have these very different systems in place, and we've had conversations around radars too and things like that. So that's where trying to get to how you sort of balance what some may view as overly conservative estimates with others who have a view that well, we need this this functionality 100% of the time. How we sort of deal with that. This is how we're kind of walking now into these things around like dynamic spectrum sharing, another strategy. How do we look at models that are other than we're just going to move systems out, or we're just going to do something exclusive here, because those choices are getting a lot harder to make in those opportunities. So again, consensus is only increasingly important. It's interesting you said consensus. I've always thought of consensus as not quite unanimity. It's maybe close. I know in the international context, right, sometimes consensus means people finally just stop arguing, and that equals consensus, right? Which was kind of interesting to me. Like you just tire people out till they give in, I guess. But
so there's this idea that we talked about before about lowest common denominator, where all parties are equally unhappy.
Right.
I mean, how do you get away from that? How do you make consensus, or the idea of just bringing folks together, like value add for all parties? So where does that rank in priority and in actually getting effective progress?
No, I think that goes back to what I've kind of already said. The more we can get the parties together to debate the issues, or to discuss, or to express their concerns at the beginning of the process. So, the commission, everything's done through a public record and the comments and reply comments, and we build this record. But there's nothing that prevents parties from getting together on their own, who have differences of opinions, and maybe being able to work those out. I would highly encourage folks to look for those opportunities. There are some of the formal opportunities, sort of like where with paths, or the Ember studies, or some of these others that we've set up through various band studies and whatnot. But I think in many cases, the commission has encouraged parties to get together and try to work things out, and to some success. I mean, up at 60 gigahertz, we had encouraged the WiGig folks to talk with the radar folks, and it took a while, but they were able to reach a compromise on how to structure that spectrum to permit all those different technologies to coexist on various basis and different power levels and different opportunities. So those are things that I highly encourage folks out there in the industry to try to think about, before filing comments with us, or maybe even after filing comments and seeing where the lay of the land is from that initial set of thoughts that people have, because I think it's to folks' advantage. The more people keep fighting at the commission through the comments and the ex partes, and basically having such disparate opinions, it makes it hard on the commission, because we have to pick something, or we have to find that compromise to satisfy all these different things. If folks from the industry can come up with things that are going to work and allow the business plans that folks are thinking about to be put into place, and to get a business going, I mean, wouldn't it be better to get a rulemaking done in half the time, because folks can come into us and say, hey, look, we were able to come up with a way that we think is going to work for all of us, instead of having battles go on in the comments and the ex partes for year after year in some cases, which makes it really hard to reach, to come to the regulatory decision. Because I mean, look, we at the commission, we want to see folks succeed, and what's our role? Create a level playing field for folks to enact their business plan, to and then let the ideas succeed or fail on their own merit, without us necessarily getting in the way by being over regulatory, but at least creating that field and that environment so that everybody gets a fair shake. So if folks can figure out ways to do that and short circuit that, it gives you a chance for businesses who are in the business of trying to make money, the opportunity to do that a lot quicker than necessarily waiting on the, having to wait for the commission to sort out, and referee some of these really difficult spectrum battles.
I already mentioned inputs into decision making. So Derek, on the implementation plan, you already mentioned that. There'll be opportunities to participate, but what are you looking at in terms of achieving successful outcomes on those objectives and the inputs that you'll be asking for and opening it up? Is there a role for informing and like the collaboration building, like what I just described?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I talked about that a little bit, but I and I think more information will be forthcoming. I think on the band studies, then we have some information very soon coming out there on how to engage. But I think more generally, we're looking at really across the pillars how we do that. I mean, some of that's already happened, right? Under Pillar 3, there's a national R&D plan, and there was already a request for comment. So that's been a process. There was a workshop recently during NSF Spectrum Week back in Arlington, Virginia. And we're going to look at that on the workforce development and other areas too. Under this collaboration framework, we're hopefully close to standing up the CSMAC again for a new cycle, and we anticipate CSMAC playing a role, not just the committee itself, which has 30 members, but potentially establishing, working groups out of that to work on different topics, both as part of the NSS, but also I think just more generally, right? Like there are issues the national spectrum strategy is very comprehensive, but we know it's not, it's not everything, right? Things still come up in the spectrum world, and our new topics emerge, and we're trying to establish mechanisms and frameworks for how we deal with issues going forward, right? Not just the discrete ones in the NSS. So that's one vehicle. And I think we're, always open to more ideas too. And the thing I'd say is, our doors and our phone lines are always open. And, I know a lot of people don't hesitate to reach out, but if you got ideas and you want to have conversations with folks, we're certainly open to that. So, we know the government can't do this alone, right? It's not really a true national strategy if you don't have some buy-in from the private sector. Again, I keep coming back. You're not going to make everyone 100% happy all the time, but I think if you provide those opportunities and those frameworks, people at least feel like they have that opportunity to provide that, that influence and that input.
Yeah. Great. I'll bring up one last topic, and then we'll see if there's questions in the audience. We might need a mic runner since I'm stuck in a chair. All right. So, applying consensus building to the spectrum challenges of today, we did mention a few of those. Any specific technical issues or debates, or anything that we should be thinking about in terms of the path forward for issues that are really prevalent today?
Well, we got lots of issues prevalent today, and it's sort of changes band by band. I think as you kind of look through the spectrum and look at the various things we're looking at, they're all different. We're looking at the lower 3 gigahertz band, and there we're looking at how do we create opportunities in a very challenging, heavily used DoD radar environment. Look at the 7 to 8 gigahertz, the other band that's real prominent within the spectrum strategy. There, we're looking at, we got fixed systems, mobile systems, satellite systems. You've got unlicensed operating there. Ultra wideband has a lot of presence there. You've got a lot of DoD systems in there. So, there are different issues. So it's hard to kind of wrap your arms around and saying it's this or that or the other thing, because each band presents different challenges, different opportunities as you go through it. But I think that just comes back to what I previously said. If we can identify who the stakeholders are, and if there's ways to create the opportunities for those discussions to happen very early on in the process, and people can express what their concerns are, and creative ideas, brainstorm on how we can satisfy as many of those needs as possible, recognizing, we can't always, get everybody everything they want. But, we do the best we can, to provide as much opportunity as we can. And and provide for the opportunities that folks want to be able to do. So again, it just it's hard to answer, but because it does I'll repeat, it does depend, but the more work people can do up front, I think it help things move along.
Yeah, Derek.
Yeah, so I think to me it really comes down to the fact that there aren't these pristine bands anymore. I mean, we're not going to move. I mean, it's in the law. Right? We're not going to move away from looking for opportunities to make spectrum available, for say, so the FCC can do inclusive licensing, right, or something that's that's pristine for or close to pristine for a new opportunity or pretty unencumbered. But the reality is those that's not really the world we're moving into. So one of my thoughts here is I think where we need help too is there's only so much you can do on the the regulatory structures here. How you can, yes, we get information in front of us and we can make decisions on carve things up and whatnot. But I think we're really interested in is the technology advancements. That's where I think the private sector and the academia really come up with these ideas on coexistence and how we can move the ball forward. And there's a lot of different, again, I mentioned things like how we look at radars or passive systems. But even just some of the technology involved with sharing, there's so much innovation out there happening, and how do we bring that all sort of together? And this ties to the R&D plan and other things. We have the NTIA is running the Wireless Innovation Fund, which is funding for open systems like ORAN and stuff. And light bulbs have gone off, and we've talked to some companies about, hey, we can look at that. Maybe we can figure out a way that we build these spectrum sharing capabilities into the network. We open up the RIC, the interfaces, X apps and R apps and all this stuff, all these different things that could come into play on how industry helps solve some of these coexistence and sharing challenges. Because again, I think if we just rely on FCC and to put it in the rules, I think you're limited on what you can do. We really need, I think, the sort of next generation, technology advances to help there, and how to proliferate that, widely. How to bring that into, the ITU to the standards bodies, right? I mean, people have talked forever about privacy by design, cybersecurity by design, spectrum sharing by design. How do we get that mindset? And I know it's a challenge because again, there's segments of the private sector who, are walking slowly toward that because the models always work for them. That we like to get our spectrum, do what we want with it. But I think as we think longer term, again, I think those are the challenges that aren't going away.
Yeah, I think that it's a good point that folks should be forward-looking in their technology and what they're thinking as we do look at various bands across the spectrum and what's in the art of the possible. One of the pillars is, Derek mentioned, the National Spectrum Strategy is research and development. And, a lot of times, again, in our proceedings, they're based on the technology of today, knowing things are not going to get implemented, for a few years forward. And folks, I think, should also focus on, where the technology is going and how can we use these new developments in order to create these opportunities. Because where we might not be able to do something with the existing equipment base today, there might be things that can be done based on where the development is. So that's, I think folks should keep an eye on that R&D world and, get a sense of where things are in that, in that life cycle for, just kind of, the light bulb went off in somebody's mind to, this is really close to hitting an assembly line and getting out there and availability, and I think that's something we don't always do a great job at, is trying to figure out how can we take advantage of all these new developments, and I think, again, going back to the commission in our policy statement from a year and a half ago or so, that's something I think we tried to put out there, that we are trying to be more forward-looking, see what's happening. How do we use those developments in order to create better frameworks for folks to operate in, and keep moving the ball forward and building these things in from the get-go. Spectrum sharing by design, or however you want to call it, for various bands.
Yeah, and better systems too, right? I mean, we've heard for a long time people who they develop systems when maybe you weren't in a crowded spectrum environment, so you had wide open filters, or you weren't worried so much about your out of band emissions, and so again, it comes back to this efficiency and being a good spectrum, that, and just trying to, and I know it's partly on us to figure out how to incentivize that. I mean, you can ask the federal, NTIA is very focused on efficiency of federal operations, and there's a lot of, hoops that agencies jump through to demonstrate that their technologies are good shares, are good neighbors. A lot of these federal bands can have as many as 10 different agencies operating in them. So coexistence has been something, that we dealt with on within the federal world, and now we think about how we expand that to federal and non-federal and everybody in the spectrum environments.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, we've got about 15 minutes left. Let's transition to some Q&A. And so, who has the first question? Let's see. Richard? We have a microphone, I think, for the, especially the virtual folks.
Richard Bernhardt with the WISPA and Wind Forum. I have a little bit of experience working on multi-stakeholder groups and consensus building and standards. Sometimes they're easier than others. Mm-hmm. And CBRS, this room alone, there's about 10 of us that I think after each one of these type of meetings, we'll go down and have coffee or drinks, whatever, in the evening. And it's the same people who've been together forever. So we know a little bit about each other's background, and coming to consensus on things is sometimes a little easier. When we went into the 6 gigahertz multi-stakeholder group, we had 180 different groups, some diametrically opposed. And consensus is first about developing a level of trust that the people you're talking to are going to stand up to what they say and work with you. And at least you can find some commonalities and hopefully come together on those. I want to know where both the NTIA and the FCC is on continuing groups like that, or working with the standards groups that are similarly situated, multi-stakeholder groups, if you will, and how we can help you as industry. We're not miracle workers either. Pulling together those factions is a lot of work. You guys also mentioned, both of you mentioned coexistence. And I don't see coexistence in the same realm as getting to a regulatory solution for a particular band. Coexistence has always been a difficult nut because different parties using different technologies in different ways don't get along so easily. And it was very, very abundantly clear in CBRS. I ran the coexistence committee for 2.5 years, and I wish I could say we came to consensus in the end, but we didn't. We brought a lot of common points together. Ongo Alliance tried to do the same thing and sort of came to some conclusions, but also had the same frustrations. So I guess what I'm asking is where can we help you, and how can we work together to try and get to those consensus in meaningful ways to try and move the process along, and to do it expeditiously? Because as Ira said, the quicker we can pull through some of these processes, the more unified we can be, the more quickly we can bring it to you.
Thanks. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So yeah, I mean, the multi-stakeholder groups, I mean, it's something, the commission, I think, has made use of more often in the last number of years than previously. And then certainly the larger ones in looking at, some of these other bands, like lower 3 gigahertz and such. But, you do make a good point. So like CBRS, but at the time, some of the multi-stakeholder groups were convened, folks had already kind of converged on what we were getting to. There was kind of a common goal. We had multi-stakeholder group when the commission did C-band among the satellite folks and the terrestrial folks. Again, they went in with kind of the idea, everybody was in agreement on where the end game was. 6 gigahertz was a little bit different. As you said, you had several groups, the unlicensed folks and the fixed wireless folks and the broadcast auxiliary folks, very diametrically opposed. And, folks kind of dug in their heels to some respect. And that was not as successful as trying to get something to the commission that we can work with. And hence that proceeding did drag out for quite a while and was very contentious. So, then it gets back to, where are there places that can you develop by the parties at least getting together developing some set of common ground and some trust, and understanding, again, not necessarily to dig heels in to say, hey, it's my way or the highway, but knowing that, hey, the commission wants to try to move the ball forward, create more opportunities. And 6 gigahertz case was provide opportunities for the unlicensed to expand while making sure that the fixed service and the broadcast auxiliary folks were fully protected. Now, some of that gets definitional. You mentioned coexistence, which gets down to, we always look at it in terms of harmful interference. And harmful interference, the definition is qualitative. It's not quantitative. And what's harmful to somebody might not be harmful to somebody else. It gives us a lot of kind of leeway to kind of figure out what's going to work, that we don't get necessarily down a very narrow path that it's the same thing in any case, in any band, for any system, because it's not. Some folks can tolerate more than others due to either what what they're trying to accomplish, or the type of technology, and so forth. So so I think, again, it gets into, can we get folks together kind of towards the beginning? Are people willing to provide useful information to the other side, so everybody at least has a common understanding of what the absolutes are for any given entity, and where there might be room to kind of move towards the middle. And then maybe from there, you can kind of come up with a sense of what will work, or what folks can live with, that provides, that meets all these different goals. Because again, the spectrum is much more crowded today than it was yesterday, than it was a year ago, was 5 years ago. And it's only going to keep getting that way. And from the regulator standpoint, we need to keep finding ways to make sure that the United States, can, that all our spectrum users have the opportunities to expand, to provide for the best systems they can. I mean, where are the trends? We're going towards 5G, 6G, 7G, 8G, who knows where we're going, but the trends are for bigger and bigger bandwidths. Where are they going to come from? Well, we got to kind of take a step back and see, how can we kind of look at the spectrum and make it work, knowing that this is in our national interest to be able to accommodate all of the various uses, but to do it in a very smart, intelligent way. And I think folks, generally agree that, we need to provide for all these. Where the disagreements come in is, it's kind of the NIMBY, not in my backyard type thing, but there's not a lot of backyard left. So now we're thinking, how do we take advantage of the new technologies, all the research, advanced antenna systems, better filtering, better databases, better processing, AI, machine learning. We have all these tools in front of us that we need to think, how do we use all these things, put them together in a smart way, and satisfy all these parties. And again, if we can do it, a lot of it at the beginning, it makes moving forward a lot easier. I mean, I'm not sure that fully answers the question, but it's kind of the way I'm kind of viewing a lot of this and how it needs to come together.
Yeah, so a lot there from Ira. I mean, I would I would say certainly in the CBRS context, the Wind Forum, the ongoing, all that has been completely essential. I mean, we're entirely grateful. We've been certainly actively involved with you folks. And again, on the comments earlier, hopefully your drink this evening is a real celebratory one, with this big movement we're making here. But in general, I think part of the challenge too, as Ira said, that was a specific case. You have identified body or form, with unique interest in that band. I think for some of these other topics where they're more wide open, it's which form, what's the vehicle, is it something set up by NTIA or FCC? Is it under the National Spectrum Strategy? Is it using existing industry body? How you sort of navigate all that, I think, is a real challenge, particularly for issues that are more broadly applicable, or you don't have that outcome in mind, right? You're just sort of opening it up, and that's a challenge I think we really face, that we're trying to navigate through, is how to be a little more specific there where it makes sense. But we welcome it. Again, government should not be doing all of this, right? This really needs to be, in many cases, private sector led, innovation led, right? And then the regulatory frameworks put in place, to allow, industry and the government operations to flourish.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I think we can.
Okay, so, Navy, others, they're not quite here. Maybe they can come next time and add comments to. But when we're speaking about, I don't like the word the trust. I think we're all coming into trying to protect ourselves and then figure out from a Department of the Navy standpoint, how do we get to yes? I know that maybe industry wants a quick yes, but we have to satisfy our leadership and our program offices and our missions. But our goal is to figure out a yes, but protect our equity. I just wanted to put it out. So we're not coming from a no, and we distrust. We have a lack of trust. We don't come from that standpoint. We come from a how can we get to a yes that we're all equally happy, or like said, equally unhappy, but we like to go to the happy place. Thank you.
Thanks, and I think that gets to some of what we've kind of already said. Yeah, I mean, yeah, how do we get to yes? And maybe again, talking about trust, and maybe the better word is mutual understanding. Might be a better way to frame it, because again, like you said, from the Navy standpoint, you got to make sure you can complete the missions that are set out for you, satisfy your leadership, that you're not going to, that the outcomes for what you need to do, what is essential, aren't compromised. On the same token, I think, again, trying to think about how we take advantage of all these new advances, provide opportunities that can occur while allowing for more efficient spectrum use for other users in the band. And again, doing it in an intelligent way that there's a level of confidence that those missions will be able to be completed, and these other users can make use of the band and be able to provide more new opportunities for other uses.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the comment, and I think sometimes people also lose sight of the requirements that are escalating on the government side, and particularly on the military side, in this geopolitical world we live in, and the adversaries who are investing in technology too. So technology and innovation requirements they're heavy on the government side too. I mean, we here Department of Defense. I mean, it's connected warfare. It's electronic warfare now. It isn't. The spectrum requirements are only increasing. So these are challenges that we all do need to be on the same page and again figure out best ways to move forward collectively as a nation.
All right. I think we might have time for one more.
Hi, Casey Pugh Dissa, one of the other DoD people. So I'm curious, from a regulator perspective, what do you view as like the limitations on consensus? So for instance, like what areas should we really not be focusing our time and energy? Because when it gets to a regulatory level, you won't be able to enforce that type of decision. So like if a body like the CBRS Alliance comes together and says, we think in this band, a specific radio access technology is the best way forward, but then the regulator, you have to be technology agnostic. So like, what are those limitations on consensus that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think the one you just mentioned is probably the biggest one. Is we do try to be technology neutral to the extent we can, and not pick winners or losers. But as I said earlier, let folks implement technology business plans that can succeed or fail because they're superior, or it's what the public wants, or meets the needs of the agencies or whatnot. So maybe that's kind of the biggest ones. Folks come to us often, and a solution is based on proprietary technology. And that's just not something the commission is really going to adopt rules that put in place the ability for a single company to be able to implement something at the expense of everybody else. So that might be number one for sure. Beyond that, I think you just need to always think realistically. Remember, we operate in it's a legal framework that we fit the engineering into, the policy goals, and the economics, and that all has to blend. And that might be something to kind of think in mind, that those all kind of have to work in some sort of a balance. And the greatest engineering technology solution may not be something we can necessarily implement for various reasons, because there are trade-offs on the legal side, or there are trade-offs on the economic side. Or like we've had folks come to us and say, I've got this great idea and it's going to work in this band, and folks don't understand the spectrum, who the other users are, or why, or it's a they say, oh, this band's really quiet. Well, there's a reason for that, because it's allocated, for space sciences and research. So it's a passive band. So I think that's the other thing, is and making sure you have a full understanding of the makeup of various bands, and make sure what you're thinking is you're putting in there is not dead on arrival, simply because you don't have an understanding of the spectrum layout itself. And one thing I want to note, just on the lighter side, I don't know if people can see, but Derek's got the spectrum chart on his socks.
That's right.
So if people had that,
Live and breathe it.
So if you can just check that real quick if you need to to quickly know what's where. You walk around with it everywhere every day. So
yeah.
Derek is known for his style, specifically on panels, because of this. But I wasn't going to mention it. But now that you did,
That's pretty funny.
yeah,
I mean, I said, I think it's, I don't know, the more anybody out there can work toward consensus, I think is great. There may be limitations. I mean, as Ira said, you're maybe a technology, but on the other hand, if you have technology and you're able to have technical parameters, I mean, it's possible to commission, you at least just can make sure it's technical rules, that service is able to operate. There may not be crafted for that service, but it's not going to do any good to, develop something and then it doesn't actually fit with, the technical rules for the band. So, I mean, there may be things like that. And, but from the NTI perspective, I mean, we're happy to see consensus in these different forums, bring things forward. So I'm not sure I'd add much on what to not think about there, because again, depending upon who's part of that consensus, it could be extremely helpful, right? Particularly if there's any sort of not adversarial, but very sort of distinct entities with different interests who are able to come together and agree on things. Generally, that's going to be a positive.
All right. Well, we are out of time, and I just want to.
Can I just say thank you, just a quick thank you.
Oh, sure.
It's important because
Okay.
just a few minutes ago, the
It went out.
NTIA letter to FCC went out for this clutter using CBRS for DP.
Do you want to mention that again?
Yeah, no, it's perfect. Again, just perfect timing with this conference, because again, we were able to bring in clutter considerations into there and extend.
And what does the press release say again?
I'm sorry.
What does the press release say again?
The press release is about this letter, which we have filed now electronically with the commission, saying that the parties, we've done this work to be able to reduce the DPAs in these geographic areas, affect the population. And then, the FCC.
I mean, basically it's saying, look, we can adjust the propagation models that we use for CBRS. In large part, it's adjusting the way we treat the clutter, among a few other parameters. But I think clutter was the biggest one in order to reduce the size of the dynamic protection areas that were reaching into places as far as Arizona and other areas, Nevada, that were fairly far from the coast, using some more realistic looking at things that now folks there don't have to worry about getting kicked off the air because a dynamic protection area was activated due to the presence of a Navy radar somewhere in the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Gulf. So, but I think, as Derek mentioned it, the analysis shows that it would provide unencumbered usage to it's somewhere 70, 80 million additional pops, across the U.S., which just creates a better CBRS service.
It's a good example of consensus, NTIA, FCC,
Right.
and SAS administration.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
No, absolutely huge deal. And the SAS administrators who now, I mean, the next step will be they just have to demonstrate that they can implement it, which, we don't see a problem there. I'll throw, throw a bone to Michael Calabrese here. Stay tuned. Next week, New America's hosting something on this. So, Is it Michael? Is it going to be streamed to or just in person?
Yeah, it'll be. This is morning of next Tuesday morning, June 18th, 10:30 a.m. Both in person in DC at New America and live stream. So if you go to newamerica.org, please at least tune in if you're out of town. NTIA, DOD, FCC, all giving kind of initial remarks. An industry keynote from Ongo Alliance and a panel with some of the other stakeholders.
Yeah, so we're really excited about this development. We think it's great news.
Yeah, I feel like we could transition into a whole new panel, if not for our agenda. So please help me thank Ira and Derek.